One day during my undergrad years, my professor started class by drawing the political spectrum on the board. To the left of the center, he wrote Democrats, and to the right of the center, he wrote Republicans. Then, to the left of Democrats, he wrote Socialists, and to the right of Republicans, Capitalists. On the far left, he wrote Communists, and on the far right, he wrote Anarchists. This one-dimensional political spectrum was wrong, of course. In truth, the political spectrum actually has two dimensions. On the far left, communism, and on the far right, capitalism. But as the political compass shows, on the top is authoritarianism, and at the bottom is libertarianism. One can be an authoritarian communist, like Stalin, or one can be an anarcho-communist, like Bakunin and Kropotkin. Similarly, one can be an authoritarian capitalist, like the fascists and corporatists, or one can be an anarcho-capitalist, like Rothbard and Bloch. Similarly, there can actually be economic centrists who are either authoritarian or libertarian. Today I'm going to speak with a radical libertarian centrist. He has taken two 19th century economic philosophies, Mutualism and Georgism, and married them under the banner of geo-mutualism. My guest today is Will Schnack. For anyone else who does enjoy this interview, please do show your support by subscribing to Primo NUTMEG. Also stop by our Patreon page and become a supporter for just $1 a month. Thanks again, folks, and I hope that you enjoy this interview with William Schnack. William Schnack, welcome to Primo NUTMEG.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
Before we get into geo-mutualism per se, could you go through defining for the listeners what mutualism is and what Georgism is?
So, mutualism is an anarchist philosophy that comes from Pierre-Joseph Proudon, who was a French philosopher. And the idea behind mutualism is that all of our interactions should be based in a kind of ethic of reciprocity and should be mutual. And when applied to the economy, this implies a mutual bank, which would be owned by the people who bank there. The bank would issue interest-free loans to the members. And this would allow them to acquire capital for themselves and become self-employed and cooperatives rather than rely on bosses. And mutualism also has a application to land. Generally, mutualists will apply occupancy and use standards to land, to where no one can hold title to a piece of land without directly occupying and using it, put it to some kind of use. And then Georgism is actually an American philosophy by a fellow by the name of Henry George. And the main idea behind Henry George's philosophy is that the land should essentially belong to no one or everyone in common, and that this is best done by allowing people to individually rent and occupy land from the commons, and this would take the form of paying a land value tax, which would equal the total value of the economic rent from the land. And the economic rent is the difference in the value between different grades of land.
So when Kevin Carson was on my show, he actually mentioned Henry George as being influenced by Proudhon. Do you see that as being the case?
Yeah, well, Henry George actually mentions Proudhon in, it's either the introduction or the preface of Progress and Poverty, Henry George's famous book. And he kind of mentions that he's trying to extend the, he didn't use the term libertarian socialist. I forget the terms he used exactly. But essentially he was saying that he was trying to extend the libertarian socialist project of Proudhon. But the main difference between Georgism and mutualism would be that George wasn't necessarily so critical of the state. He was more of a classical liberal, and he was fond of a Republican-style government, so he wanted to make significant changes, like allowing for a women's Congress and things like that. But the main difference is actually just that Henry George wasn't opposed to the state, while Proudhon would see the state as a kind of infringement on that ethic of reciprocity, because the state's an involuntary institution. And actually, Proudhon had very, very similar views to Henry George, though they weren't as well worked out, and I think it's useful to look at Henry George's work for that reason. But Proudhon did tackle the issue of economic rent and did suggest in some of his works, like the general idea of the revolution, that economic rent was an issue to be sorted out. Though he'd sort it out in different ways from Henry George sometimes. He did mention rent payments, but he would also be more okay with distributing land in a manner that would make up for differences in quality with differences in quantity. I don't necessarily think that works out so well. I think the Georgist solution is a little better. But Proudhon, in that sense, was something of a proto-Georgist in that he did deal with economic rent. It was a major concern of his. And they both really inherited that from the classical liberal tradition. People like Thomas Paine, even people like Baruch Spinoza, thought that the rent of the land was an issue to be sorted out.
Well, on the subject of the bank, I would be curious because I know that Fred Fulbury, who has kind of resurrected Georgism to some degree under the banner of geo-libertarianism, I know that he confronts the subject of central banks and banking, but did Henry George ever discuss that, and did he ever mention Proudhon's model for a credit bank?
You know, Henry George was familiar with some of the different alternative currency schemes going on. The Georgists are a little critical of mutual credit and things like that because they point out rightly that rents and taxes can't be paid in mutual credit. Landlords and governments don't accept mutual credit for their rental and tax payments. And so that's one difference that the Georgists have with the mutualists. But Henry George was familiar and I think he was involved with some experiments in some mutual credit or mutual credit-like circles. But the Georgists are mostly concerned with matters of scale and, like I said, being able to pay off their rent and taxes. Whereas the mutualists, they're a little more prone to look at rent and tax payments as inherently unjust. And so they would support, rather than sorting out money around those issues, they would support something more like tax strikes or rent strikes or something of that nature, or going out and homesteading land and making yourself free from landlords. So that's kind of an issue of their approaches to, I guess, political governance. Henry George and the Georgists are okay with government, with the state, and they think that it's okay for the state to collect taxes, and especially in the form of rent, whereas mutualists would prefer it to be done through voluntary associations.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though both mutualism and Georgism were kind of forgotten about for a while. I mean, they were very big philosophies in the mid to late 19th century, but during the first part of the 20th century, it seems like that school faded out a little bit until you had people like Kevin Carson and C4SS, and then on the other hand, you have Fred Fulbury and the other Georgists. Is that true, or have these schools always had a robust tradition since their inception?
Yeah, that's largely true. I'd say that there's different waves that have occurred. The mutualist tradition has been carried on in part through the individualist anarchist tradition, and that's even extended in part through the libertarian movement. You even get, people in the libertarian movement, like the C4SS folks, like you mentioned, that do have an interest in mutualism. And as far as Georgism goes, that's kind of had its own ups and downs as well. There's the Monopoly game that was released, and that was based around Georgist values. You can look into that, the board game Monopoly.
So you're confirming that Monopoly, as it was originally designed, that was done so to kind of show the Georgist school of thought in economics.
Right. So there's a woman there. I might be pronouncing her name wrong, but her name was Lizzie Maggie or Lizzie McGee. It's M-A-G-I-E, and she was the creator of the actual prototype of the board game Monopoly, which was called the Landlord's Game. And she created it essentially to demonstrate Georgist values and to show people the corruption in the economy and stuff. And if you go through the board game and the rules and everything, it does its job very well. And there was another side to the game. I think it might have been called Progress. I've never played it. I'm not too familiar with it, but it was to actually show what happened when the Georgist corrections were made.
You did bring up libertarian socialism before, and I did want to speak about the terms capitalism and socialism, or capitalism and communism, because I know that Proudhon had feuded with Marx in the mid-19th century, and at the same regard, I know that Georgism has come under attacks from the right or from anarcho-capitalists or voluntarists, since they're talking about having a land tax. So it seems as though, to me, mutualism and Georgism are both very much towards the center of the economic spectrum. Mutualism isn't to the extent of communism, and Georgism isn't to the extent of capitalism and private property. They both seem like economically centrist philosophies. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate to say. And I think that these traditions will appeal to traditional libertarians mostly, as it appeals to their philosophy of labor. Because both the Georgist and the mutualist philosophies generally view the labor of the individual and the freedom of the individual to be of paramount importance. They're only really socialists and have a lot of fundamentally socialist values when it comes to the land. However, there is some common overlap with other socialist traditions, especially in mutualism as far as like cooperative production goes, because mutualists will favor cooperative production, and that is a socialist element. But it is ultimately founded in a libertarian ethic of free banking, allowing people to go about whatever kind of banking business they want, and being able to create mutual credit banks, and being able to have property for themselves, which are pretty libertarian ethics.
So could you explain what geo-mutualism is, what that really means as far as marrying these two schools?
Yeah, this term actually I thought I had come up with it, but a fellow had got to it for me, and his name is Jacques Coates. He's a fellow from England, and his stuff's worth looking into as well. But as far as what geo-mutualism is, geo-mutualism, it tries to marry the mutualist and the Georgist traditions, and it applies mutualism, especially in the way of banking, and it applies Georgism, especially in the way of land. But ultimately, it takes from both in both areas. And one of the essential elements is that I am kind of reconciling the differences in the occupancy and use standards of land that mutualists hold to and the land value tax of the Georgists. The way my argument would go is that land was originally held in the commons by primitive and ancient people, that common watering holes would be gone to get water, people would herd their sheep on common land, things like that. And that the state and private property are intrinsically connected because private property was a violent transition from that common ownership to a private system. And that was actually connected to the first states, because the first government's first states actually took their taxes in the form of rents. And so my argument would go that if this wasn't the case, that the best way to sort it out would be because there are some benefits to not having land used by everyone all the time, to having it used in more individual or personalized possession, that the most just or fair way of going about that, rather than violently taking it and establishing a state, would be to persuade the other commoners that you can put the land to the most productive use, and in doing so can provide them payments of the rent that they otherwise would not have. And so this would create a solution that is win-win for everybody. It'd be win-win for the person taking possession of the land, because they would be the most productive and they'd actually be able to keep more for themselves in the process as well. But in doing so, they'd be affording everyone else in compensation for not being able to use the land themselves. You'd be affording them a better life through a basic income from those rental payments. And so that's kind of my reconciliation of those, is that I would like to see Georgism practiced not so much as a state, but as a contractual relationship. I'd like to see people starting to persuade each other about who can put the land to the most productive use and who can afford everyone else the best standard of living in doing so.
Well, I would be kind of interested to know what the transition from our current system to that kind of a system would be, when you have people with titles to land and large plots of land.
Well, I think here it's actually kind of useful to look at Marx and his philosophy of the modes of production and how the modes of production have changed throughout history. In agricultural economies, land was a major factor in the economy. It was the main factor of production. Most of the wealth came from the land. In capitalist economies, things are different. Most of our wealth comes from capital, and capital is the dominant force. And so, in a capitalist economy, a large industry actually controls more than large land interests. And so, taking that further with a mutualist philosophy, I would suggest that and I think Karl Marx would suggest the next mode of production would be dominantly based around labor. And so when applied to the mutualist philosophy, I think what this means is that mutual banks have been presented a new niche in history to where they can become the dominant force, to where credit backed by labor can become the dominant force in the economy. And what this will do is allow federations of workers to exercise their social force and to it's almost like monopolize the economy, but there's no central power or anything. It's just a class of people. But in forming confederations could pressure landlords by way of not restricting trade with landlords and things like that. And if landlords do need to make trades with them, entering into the mutual credit system and punishing their credit. So having different kinds of policies to deal with the landlords who will inevitably join the dominant mutual credit system once it's going out of necessity because it's providing for the masses. And in providing for the masses, it creates a new economy. Well, it's not a macro economy, but a sub economy, a counter economy that the landlords and other kinds of capitalists have to engage with in some form in order to get economic resources at all. So I essentially want to create kind of a monopoly of labor that the landlords have to bend to, and in so doing, creating new terms of land distribution.
Now, as I understand it, Proudon actually had tried to set up a mutual credit bank during his time, and that wasn't really successful. Why was that the case? Why did that project fail, and have there been other instances of mutual credit banks being tried in other parts of the world at other times?
Yeah, well, I think Proudhon had a lot of shortcomings in that he was kind of the first anarchist, and he didn't have a whole tradition of anarchism that was backing him in history and that he could learn from. So I don't think he can be blamed for all of his shortcomings. But one of his shortcomings is that he did try to make some reforms. And I'm fond of the anarcho-syndicalist tradition and their position on reform, that reform is not something that is usually very productive, that more revolution is what is essential. And I think that Proudhon was actually coming to that kind of viewpoint towards the end of his life when he was writing works like the political capacity of the working classes. In those works, he was really trying to put a focus back on just that, the political capacity of the working class, the ability for the working classes to enact the kind of change they want directly without appealing to politicians or reform or something like that. So I would suggest that Proudhon's shortcomings with his mutual banks had to do a lot with the reform attempts that he was making, as well as just he was establishing a new idea, and there wasn't very much of a culture to back them up. So I think there's a lot of need for education and culture building. There have been many attempts at mutual credit banks and similar kinds of banks. There was Josiah Warren. He had a Times store, and this was actually possibly before Proudhon, or at least contemporary with Proudhon, and he had a lot of success with that, enough that he started some more communities, or some communities from it. This was a store that was successful, and he started a couple communities because of that. And there have been other kinds of alternative currencies. Most of them, however, have been limited because they have tried to work on strictly time valuation, setting a standard of value in time. And that's something that Josiah Warren tried to do too early on, but he learned that It wasn't only time, but also other things like repugnance that were necessary to consider in value. So there's all sorts of those currencies that exist today, and actually the government kind of allows those to exist. But as far as a proper mutual credit system, that's pretty much outlawed at the moment through legal tender laws and through other kinds of laws that restrict the currency from being practiced in the way we'd like it to be, such as requiring that the currency be backed by U.S. dollars, which creates it only really has any use for creating a community currency where the currency is restricted to not flowing outside the community. It doesn't really serve any of the real functions of mutual credit, such as widely dispersing capital. So I think in order to, if a society were to want to establish mutual credit as a standard, the first thing would have to be education and building up a culture and using that culture to participate in widespread direct action and civil disobedience.
Yeah, I actually know that there are several different local currencies throughout the nation, and I've actually interviewed some people involved with those in the past. So for these different local currencies, is there a way for them to move more towards that mutual credit bank, or they just can't legally do it?
You know, as far as I understand, they can't legally do it, or at least the hurdles are so high that if they can legally do it, the benefits of doing so really aren't worth the cost. But as far as what they could do if they wanted to do it anyway, I think what they should do is stop working on an hour basis of currency, because what ends up happening is people end up exchanging multiple hours for a single hour when a job ends up being more difficult or requires more skill anyway. And instead of that, move to more like the way a pawn shop functions, to where people would take their items or their warehouse receipts to the bank and use the actual hard goods, like possibly like the furniture that someone makes from their carpentry shop or something like that, or even promissory notes to perform future labor, such as maybe a barber needs a loan and the bank looks at the market and sees that he can bring in so much income with it just his barber work, and that he's got bills of credit that show that he's good for his contracts. So in that case, it'd be useful to use the barber's future labor and accept his promissory note as a basis for currency. And so what I'd like to see is banks issuing currency on actual goods and services rather than on abstract ideas like value should only be measured in terms of time. I think that we need to be actually using actual goods and services. And that's the way pawn shops function today. So it's been tried and done. It's just a matter of doing it in a cooperative setting. The pawn shop type bank would be owned by the consumers who bank there rather than by a private person. And as the owning interests, they would offer themselves interest-free loans for their goods and services rather than charging interest on themselves and profiting from themselves and each other. So it'd be more of like a community-owned, non-profit-oriented bank.
To me, this sounds like it also cuts into another big division between right and left, especially in the libertarian spectrum, between the labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value. So what you're describing, would this be marrying those two theories as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a common theme in mutualism, since the beginning, is that utility and labor aren't necessarily at odds. That when two people engaging in an interaction, in a economic interaction, economic exchange, they're both, as long as they're not privileged in a monopoly position or something like that, they're both going to take into consideration the cost of their labor in making that exchange. So if I'm a carpenter and I have money from making my carpentry goods, when I spend that money, I'm going to think about, maybe not directly think about that, but in the back of my mind, I know that represents so much labor that I've done. And the person that I'm making an exchange with, as long as they, they're not in a privileged position where they have monopoly status and have a bunch of surplus they're trading with. If they're trading with their own production, or they're trading with production of someone else which they've compensated for with their own production, then they're feeling those costs, and they're thinking about those costs in the same way that I am. And the way that they think about it is in terms of utility. They're thinking about their labor, but they're thinking about it in terms of utility. Is it worth sacrificing this much labor, which is worth this much utility to me, for this other item or service that also has utility possibly?
Have you found there more opposition to geo-mutualism coming from the anarcho-capitalist and voluntarist school, or coming from the anarcho-communist school?
You know, being in the center is a real weird place, because you get allies on both sides and you get enemies on both sides. Being in the center, you're in the crossfire oftentimes. So I'm oftentimes called a communist by capitalists, and I'm called a capitalist or even a fascist by communists. But also when people delve into my ideas, they start to feel a lot of sympathy for them. So it really depends on how much exposure each side is willing to allow themselves of the viewpoint. And that's why I think that with enough exposure and with enough open minds on both sides, that I think geo-mutualism could be something of a compromise for both sides. And so I actually promote a view called geo-mutualist panarchism because of that, which is my appeal as a geo-mutualist and who wants to live in a specifically geo-mutualist economy to other kinds of people with a couple of our tools. Those tools being the land value tax, which I'd like to see practiced between communities as diverse as capitalists and communists and nationalists and whatever. And the other is mutual credit. And I think that that's necessary for the equation because, especially as it relates to disputes. If a dispute occurs between these different factions, there needs to be some manner of settling that dispute. And so an agreed upon currency for that purpose, I think, is necessary. I think mutual credit can serve that role just fine, and accept the gross domestic product of each participant as a basis for currency.
Well, I think that's something that might confuse some of the anarcho-capitalists, is that you're saying that you're an anarchist or a panarchist, and yet, something like you just said where you'd want a land value tax. How would you collect a land value tax in a stateless society?
Right, I understand. And actually, I listened to the Fred Bolberry interview that you had on the show recently, and he answered this question in a great way, and I think it's the same way that I'd like to answer it, is that, it's a tax in form, it's not a tax in substance. So it looks like a tax, but because of the nature of it, and here I might describe it a little differently than Fred Bolberry, but I think they're pretty similar. Because of the nature of the tax, what we're calling a tax, is it's really more of a compensatory program, the way that a dispute would be settled in court. If someone steals your chair from or someone steals your car from you and you take it to court, they're going to have to compensate you back for your car. If they're going to have to give you back your car, or if they destroyed that car, they're going to have to compensate you back for another car. And that's not a tax. At least it's not a tax in substance. It kind of looks like a tax because wealth is being extracted from someone, even though they're the thief. Wealth is being extracted from them and given to someone else. So you could say that's a tax in form, and it's a tax in form in the same way that the land value tax is, because the land value tax is a mechanism of compensation. It's saying if you're going to exclude everyone else from the commons, that you have to compensate them for all the costs that they would otherwise that they're facing from not being able to use that on their own without your interference. And so, in that sense, it's not a tax in substance, but a tax in form. And some would argue that it's not a tax at all.
So I think the argument there, or the disagreement, is that it seems as though people who aren't anarcho-capitalists may consider land to be common property, or nature is something that existed, prior to people, so that everybody has kind of an equal claim on it. But the ANCAP position is that an individual can go and homestead land and take ownership that way. Or, I suppose, if you're buying land, even if that was originally, the subject of violent conquest at one point in time, your purchase of it is a peaceful and voluntary act. So, what is wrong with that position saying that land can be privatized, that, every individual can own their own plot of land?
Well, I don't necessarily agree disagree in every circumstance. The reason is that I think that if everyone can own a piece of the land, and if that land is of relatively equal value, then what you have is not private property, but personal property. And I'm fine with personal property. The thing is, the land, it comes in different grades of value. And it's something that wasn't created by human labor or human effort. And so I think it's best to sort it out, because there's going to be different claims on that land. Different people are going to want to use that land. Someone might get there first, but there's not necessarily intrinsic reason for everyone else to respect that claim on behalf of that individual. And the interesting thing is that the anarcho-capitalist position on private property can be traced back to John Locke and John Locke's original argument of homesteading. But they leave out a very important part, which is the Lockean proviso. And in the Lockean proviso, John Locke essentially states that homesteading is great, fine, but you have to leave enough for other people to homestead. And you have to leave enough of equal value for other people to homestead. In one of the passages, he puts this in terms of taking a draft from a river. It doesn't matter if someone goes and takes a drink from the river, because everyone else can go and take a drink from the river. Now, if someone were to go and drink the whole river, that wouldn't leave anything else for anyone else and be a problem for everyone else, and all those people would have a reason to oppose that person continually drinking probably too much from the river. So it's interesting there, because they trace their argument back to John Locke, but that's not how John Locke felt about it. John Locke had actually had a view that was more of a predecessor to someone like Henry George or even Pierre-Joseph Proudon, that there needs to be common access for folks, and that if private ownership is allowed to continue on perpetually, and ownership is allowed to happen continually through generations, that there might not be enough for everyone else to have. And that puts them in an unfair position. It's like starting off a race with someone yards ahead. And so at that point, the market can't even really do its job of sorting out efficiency and stuff like that, because it's kind of got a lag on it.
Something that I have always been kind of confounded by in this argument between right and left within the libertarian spectrum is that there's a uniting principle that government should be either limited or abolished. And it seems to me like in a world where, in a stateless society, there would be both communist communities and capitalist communities, and in between, as well as geo-mutualist communities. Because, a city and a town, a rural community and an urban community, they're going to be very different, I would think. So do you see that as the case? Do you see a stateless society as having many different kinds of economic flavors, or do you think that it would necessarily have to be under a sort of compromise system like geo-mutualism?
Well, I think it's necessary to orient this question in the real world, or at least my answer. I want to orient my answer in the real world. And so my answer to that is that at one time we had widespread anarchy, and it was the most common form of human relation for the longest periods of human time as we lived as hunter-gatherers. But something threw that off, and the state happened, and the state became normalized to such an extent that we really can't point to an existing anarchy anymore, and we certainly can't point to an existing industrial anarchy. So this presents us a situation to where any anarchist society that comes about must be able to displace the current existing state and current existing structures. And I don't believe that an anarcho-communist or an anarcho-capitalist society is capable of making that kind of displacement move. And the reason for that is I think that both suffer from extreme inefficiency. I think that capitalism suffers from its private property, which creates lots of problems for people. It creates a lot of surplus. Lots of things get produced in a capitalist economy. They don't get well distributed. A communist economy is much different. There's not very much stuff distributed or produced in the first place because there's not very much incentive to work. And so people face widespread scarcity. I don't think widespread scarcity or mass surplus is capable of overthrowing our current system, because I think our current system is based on a philosophy that can be traced back to someone like Plato, who did a pretty good job of balancing these kinds of opposing forces. And so we have a very well balanced system as it is, and that's what has allowed it to kind of displace that original anarchy. The original anarchy, it was an anarchy not de jure but de facto, and I call it that because people in hunter-gatherer societies, they just don't have the means to impose themselves as a government on another person. And so this presents us a situation where we have to create an anarchy de jure, which means that we have to create confederations, and these confederations have to protect the rights of individuals and constantly take actions to abolish any state that would want to rear its head. And so this kind of goes back to a more social anarchist tradition like the collectivist or anarcho-communist school as it relates to social organization. I think that social organization is intrinsically necessary. However, as a geo-mutualist, I'm faced with a situation where my ideology is not very widespread. There's not much of an established culture. Very, very few people are even interested in mutualism or Georgism separately, much less together. And so what my interest is in combining forces with people who do think like me, but admitting the limitations of that, and with that group of people interacting in positive manners with people with different ideologies, such as anarcho-capitalists, anarcho-communists, and even statists of different varieties, and trying to establish positive relationships with them, and providing some of our tools that we think can enrich all of us. And I take a position that's kind of evolutionary. I think that we can win out as mutualists in a battle of natural selection. So I don't mind enabling some of my otherwise opponents, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I take that principle somewhat seriously. So I'll align with other forces as long as they're not happy with the current condition. And so this is where panarchism comes in, because my specific preference for a community, I understand, is not a universal one, and then I have to interact with other ideologies that don't agree with me, but who might have a common enemy in the state. And I think that, like I said before, those tools of mutual credit and the land value tax, because they're centrist tools, they could be a good point of unity or compromise for those different groups, and that we could unite for the sake of co-opetition. We could cooperate on one level so that we could do our more specific or particular things in our own communities. We can overthrow the state together, but be mutualist, communist, capitalist, nationalist, whatever we want to be, more specifically in our own communities. So in that way, I'm both an anarchist and a panarchist.
Well, it does open up the question, though, for how much do you compromise? Because let's just look at the electoral system, for example. I mean, could you cooperate electorally to try to get libertarians elected in the hopes that they're going to limit the size of government, even though you're risking them entrenching private property? Or do you work with the Green Party or socialist parties in the hopes of them establishing a public bank? I don't know if you'd be in favor of a state bank necessarily, but something along those lines, even though they're going to, again, embolden state power along the way. Or, where do you really draw that line for how far you'd be willing to compromise?
Right. I'm personally, myself, not interested in any level of reform. And I'm really, for that reason, I'm not really interested in most international politics or even national politics. My politics are kind of focused on the here and now and the most immediate and local to me. I do a lot of, big thinking writings and stuff about political systems and things like that, but I'm really using these especially to appeal to people in my own community so that I can establish different kinds of networks and systems, that I think could, to have the potential, if they were to grow, to displace, relationships of authority. And so rather than supporting political candidates or this party or the other, I really support people just talking to their neighbors and getting along in their communities and educating themselves and each other, creating community groups where people educate each other, and forming mutual aid societies of various sorts. And this is something that I try to practice in my own life. I've started a couple groups. Early on, I started a IWW branch, the DFW IWW. And that went for a couple of years, and actually one of our members went on to form a Starbucks union out of that branch. And after that, I went on to form the Black Cat Collective. And the Black Cat Collective was a kind of nonprofit mutual aid association where we just got together as different people with different views. And in the beginning, I meant it to be apolitical, not really stress any kind of ideology. Naturally, it kind of evolved from that because of the participants that we did have a lot of conversation about ideology, and it died down for that reason. I should have kept it at the original focus. But the original focus was just to get people together and talk about things that they would find mutually beneficial. And from that arose, we had a little office space that we rented from a house, and we had a little library, and we had classes out of there, and we started a group called the People's Arcane School, where people from the community would come in and talk about their various passions and teach people about their various passions, like quantum physics or Pythagoras and the harmony of the spheres or various other topics. But what I think is most important, taking that kind of action, I think people need to stop worrying about appealing to politicians and appealing to business owners and appealing to landlords, the people that we traditionally feel that we need to appeal to get things done. That we need to take the power upon ourselves and do the kind of personal growth and community growth necessary to claim power for ourselves. And that means getting together with people that are currently disempowered and who would benefit from a transition in power. And doing what you can to educate that person and support that person and get support in return from that person. And do that with a large group of people and create community networks that eventually have such a bond that you can engage in acts of civil disobedience like rent strikes, tax strikes, things like that, labor strikes, or you can start counter economies. Before any of this the kind of direct action needs to happen, though, you have to have that culture there, and you have to have these community organizations and relationships between those people. And that means focusing very little on people at the top, focusing all your time on the people at the bottom. And that's been my approach. I don't really engage in politics. I don't really support anyone else engaging in politics. I support people engaging in positive relationships with each other, and in doing so, making the state less necessary in our lives and more of an obvious burden so that we can then begin to displace it.
Well, if, let's say the state of Texas or the state of Connecticut were to found a public bank that would have its own currency, and, that maybe was even done in conjunction with something like a land value tax, would you see that as a positive move? Would you see that as progress, or because it's centered on the state accomplishing that as something that's necessarily bad?
Well, I think it's necessarily bad, and the reason is that anytime you have a central organization that imposes itself as that kind of monopoly, you have problems in the value system. If anyone disagrees with that, they can't go somewhere else. So I'd be more along the lines, in agreement with someone like an Austrian school economist who would be in favor of free banking, allowing banks to create their own currencies and establish their own policies without any regulation by the government whatsoever. My only difference with the Austrian economist would be that I would prefer a mutual bank and think that a mutual bank would establish itself as the most dominant form of banking in such an economy, rather than, the Austrian economists will often support something like the gold standard.
From a free banking kind of perspective, I think that a lot of Austrian economists and a lot of voluntarists are very in favor of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, which actually has been soaring in value recently. So I would be interested to know what your thoughts are on cryptocurrency. Do you see this as a positive development or a negative development?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting value to the blockchain system. I don't necessarily think that the way it's done is efficient, because what ends up happening is you got all these people essentially doing the job of a banker. And I think we can have fewer people doing all that, the mining activity and all that, running computers or whatever. I don't think it's necessary to have everyone doing that. But I do think the blockchain technology is interesting and worth looking at. Could possibly be used even in a crypto mutual credit system. But as far as Bitcoin itself, I'm not too excited about Bitcoin. I don't really pay it too much attention. And the reason is that it's not really enabling people who already have value to make their exchanges with that value they have in the way that a mutual credit system is. You still have to go and perform the mining services, or you have to buy the Bitcoin, or you have to do something for somebody that bought the Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin is ultimately based on mining and on other government currencies. It's not establishing actual wealth as the basis of the money, the way I would like a mutual credit system to do.
Well, how about the net neutrality debate? Because that seems like a very kind of right and left thing as well, where the left is in favor of net neutrality, and the right wants internet privatized and wants private corporations. I mean, depending if you agree on the existence of incorporated business. But in any regard, where would you stand on net neutrality? Is that something that private groups should provide, or is that something that should be kind of publicly provided in something that might look akin to a government?
I'm honestly not too informed about the debate on this, but my personal inclination is that I would like to see internet services run as community cooperatives, and probably a federation of community cooperatives. So that would be something of a middle ground between private ownership and public ownership, because there's that degree of public involvement in that the cooperative would be democratic, but there's also that degree of personal ownership, because it would be a cooperative and a voluntary share or stakeholder type system.
I know that you are advocating for geo-mutualist anarchism, but you also are a dualist pantheist, or I might have that backwards, but you have a philosophical, or some might characterize it as religious point of view as well. I was just wondering if you might be able to describe that briefly.
I would call it my metaphysical view. But dualist pantheism, it's the view that nature and God aren't necessarily different things, that they're the same thing. And this kind of goes back to the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, who is kind of the father of classical pantheism, modern pantheism. And the dualist part of that is that even though I believe everything to be one thing, because one characteristic of pantheism is that pantheists understand existence to total out to be a single entity, which is a position known as monism. And all pantheists are monists, even dualist pantheists. But that dualist aspect is that even though we live in singular existence, in a singular world, that we still have a perception of separation and duality and polarities and things like that. And a school like Hinduism might suggest that we live in an illusion, the illusion of samsara, and that we need to look past this illusion. And I kind of use this kind of concept, but I think it's necessary to use the dualities and to navigate the illusion. I think the illusion serves a function. And so, looking at the different kind of dual or polar aspects in the universe and coming to understand them, I think is an essential part of coming to understand or have a relationship with God or nature.
Well, William Schnack, I really do appreciate you taking the time to do this interview on Primo NUTMEG. And for folks who were interested in this discussion, where can they learn more about you and your ideas?
You can go to my website, which is evolutionofconsent.com. That's evolutionofconsent.com. And on there I have a couple books. I have 2 books, Evolution of Consent, Collected Essays in Volumes 1 and 2. And I also have another book called Fair Shares, Community Economics for Permaculture Practitioners. And that book kind of just applies the philosophy of Ralph Borzodi and suggests that as a as a good complement to the permaculture worldview. And there's also, I'm starting a podcast. I had a little failure on my computer, so I missed an episode, but I'm trying to get another episode up this Monday. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. And I've got a bunch of essays, and I put all my new essays on there, all my writings on there, and there's links, and I've got a couple YouTube videos and stuff like that. So it's worth checking out.
Awesome. Well, William Schnack, thank you again for being on Primo NUTMEG today, and I'd love to have you back at some point in the future.
All right. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you everyone once again for listening to this interview with William Schnack on Primo NUTMEG. If you did enjoy the show, please do subscribe. Also stop by our website, primonutmeg.com. There you'll find other interviews with Ron Paul, Ralph Nader, Noam Chomsky, Kevin Carson, Walter Block, John McAfee, and many, many other interesting people. Also, please do show your support by becoming a patron for just $1 a month on our Patreon page. Thanks again, folks, and this is Steve saying, until next time.